going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today, I want to talk to you about a novel called Slan. This is a science fiction novel written by, I don't even know how to pronounce his name, so I'm not even going to try. This came out in the early 1940s, I think. I want to say 1940 is when it came out. And the premise of this book is basically, imagine the X-Men without all of the flashy superhero stuff. So no costumes, no fancy jet, no fancy mansion, none of that. This is set in the future, like a couple of thousand years in the future, and Slans are basically mutants. They are telepaths. Some of them have little tentacles on top of their heads that allow them to read thoughts. Some of them are Slans, but they don't have the tentacles and they can't read thoughts, but they are still considered to be Slans. They're called the tendrilless Slans, and this is set in a city where a Slan is shot on sight. If you think that someone's a Slan, or you are certain that someone is a Slan, they are just executed right there. And this follows a character named Jami Cross, and he starts off the book when he's, I think, 9 years old, and then by the end of the book he's 23, I think. And basically this follows his adventures in this dystopian society where he's trying to get to the bottom of why there's so much hatred towards his kind, and he's hearing all these things about how the Slans are using a machine on human babies to try and turn them into Slans, and all sorts of stuff that makes it seem like the Slans really are bad people, and he's trying to figure out if all that's true. And this is very interesting from a historical perspective. I'm a huge X-Men fan, so it was really interesting seeing a lot of the tropes of the X-Men comics in this novel, and there's a lot of it. At one point, there's a guy, he's a politician, talking about maybe we could give the Slans their own island, and they could all just live there, and that reminds me a lot of Genosha from the late 90s, early 2000s in the comics. And then you've got characters who are feared and hated, and they're executed. That has happened in some versions of the X-Men comics, like the Days of Future Past storyline, and then after Avengers vs. X-Men, you had mutants who were just arrested on sight. Not quite as dark and bleak as this book, but it's got shades of Slan there. And then you've got a lot of the political turmoil that's going on. And I really enjoyed the premise of this book. I don't think that it's necessarily very well written. There are a few things here that I just don't think work very well, and I'll try to veer away from spoilers in case you are interested in finding this book and reading it, but there are certain things that happen, especially at the very end of the book. We're leading up to a big Slan-human war that's building throughout the entire book, and then the book just kind of forgets about that at the end, and I really feel like this needed another 50 to 100 pages to really follow up on what was seeded earlier in the book. So that was a little bit disappointing. I guess that is a spoiler. I apologize. But then there are two plot twists in the very last chapter, and this book definitely needed a little bit more room to breathe to explore those two plot twists. And I won't talk about what the plot twists are. One of them was just unnecessarily stupid because it involves retconning something that happened about halfway into the book that, in my opinion, didn't really need to happen. It felt really unnecessary, and so it was retconning that thing, and so that plot twist didn't need to be there because the thing that it was retconning also didn't need to be there. And then there's another thing that makes the actions of one character throughout the entire book make absolutely no sense at all. So the pacing throughout the back half of the book is super fast, and it even skips over entire plot points that you think the book is leading up to. And then the pacing throughout the first half of the book is incredibly slow. I was reading this, and about a little less than halfway through it, I realized that not a whole lot had happened yet. I was on like page 80-something out of 190 pages, and I was realizing that so far this book had only set up the characters and the premise of this world. They hadn't actually done anything yet, and that was a little disappointing. Now, this was still a very fast read for me. Like I said, this is 190 pages. I was reading it while listening to an audiobook. That's pretty much the only way that I can read prose. My attention wanders, and I just can't hold my attention on any book unless I have an audiobook that kind of keeps me on task. And I was able to read this book in 2 days. So I'm not saying that this was boring. I'm not saying that it needed to be more exciting, because there are some really exciting moments, but like I said, about halfway in, a little less than halfway in, I was realizing that we had two protagonists and we had basically just been following them and get to knowing them, but we didn't really have any actual stuff happening at that point in the book. Now, about halfway in, things do start to pick up, and that's when the pace really picks up, and then it starts just skipping entire years. Like I said, the main character of this book is 9 years old at the beginning, and he's 23 at the end, so it skips a lot of stuff. Now, some of that isn't incredibly important, and I think if they were ever to make a movie about this, they would probably start with the character being in his late teens. They would probably do that so that they wouldn't have to try and find a child actor who can actually act and find someone who looks like the adult actor that they would need to use later. So they would probably just start the character off in his late teens if they were going to adapt this. I'm not saying they will. I don't think most people know about this book, but I do think that the pace needed to be evened out a little bit. We needed to have more actual plot stuff happen earlier in the book, and then we needed to have some plot stuff slowed down and expanded on a little bit in the last half of the book. But do I recommend this book? I would say yes. If you are a huge X-Men fan, you should really check this book out just to see where some of those influences came on not just the creators of the X-Men comics, but also later people who took some of those things and really ran with them in the 70s and the 80s. So I would recommend checking this out, bearing in mind that this is not the best written book that I've ever read. I would say this is really entertaining, lowbrow science fiction, but this is not high art or anything like that. The writing could use some work, and sometimes even the premise and the concept is just kind of schlocky, to use a word that I don't really care for. It's just kind of sloppy a little bit. That might be a better way of explaining it. But overall, without getting too much into the spoilers, I thought it was okay, but this is not the book that I was hoping that I was going to get into when I started reading it. So those are my thoughts on Slan by that guy. So I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back later this week with another video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.